Thank you all for coming. My name is Lynette Clementson, and I'm the director of Wallace House. It's great to see all of you. To see some of you, now I'm getting to know your faces, and so for those of you who have come to several of our events this academic year, it's wonderful to have your support. Wallace House has two programs here at the university: the Knight Wallace Fellowships for Journalists, which is a residential program here at the university. We bring 18 to 20 mid-career journalists every year to do immersive study here at the university. Current and former Knight Wallace Fellows, if you would raise your hand so people can see you in the room. And then Wallace House is also the home of the Livingston Awards for Young Journalists, a prestigious prize for excellence in journalism by journalists under the age of 35. We give 3 prizes a year, one for excellence in local reporting, one for national reporting, and one for international reporting. It is a program that leaves no doubt that journalism is in exceedingly good hands. The hundreds of entries we receive every year are a testament to the talent coming out of journalism programs in universities around the country, talent bubbling up from small national newspapers, magazines, from public radio, and increasingly from independent journalism. And we go through those entries with a panel of judges. And our guest today, Bret Stephens, is a Livingston Award national judge. And so he is part of the Wallace House family, and we're thrilled to have him here today. So I'm not going to introduce Bret. I'm going to leave that to a colleague, but I will say that the first time I met Bret, we had lunch. We were in a typical New York day, scheduled tightly. And in the way that maybe you schedule time for someone you're meeting for the first time, you do it bookended into your schedule in case things don't go so well, and so you can have a reason to get out quickly. I almost missed my flight, and I could have stayed and talked to Bret all afternoon. It was one of the best conversations I had had in a really long time, and in the way that sitting down to talk to someone who you have disagreements with can be stimulating if that person is thoughtful and reasonable and honest and sincere and a good human being. And Bret is all of those things. And I left dashing to LaGuardia, knowing that years from now I would feel exceedingly happy that I had met and made friends with Bret Stephens, and I have been planning ever since then to bring him here, and so really thrilled that he's here to talk to us today. You have with you programs for today, our events that we've had several this term, and our last one for this term is coming up on March 2nd. We'll be looking at China's soft power with some Knight Wallace Fellows, and we hope you will join us for that. And we're going to have questions with this event, as we do with all of ours. As you've come in, you've noticed that there are microphones in the 2 aisles. When we get to the point for question and answer, we'll invite you to come up, but we know not everyone wants to share their questions or comments standing in a microphone. And so for those of you who would like to share your questions or thoughts via Twitter, please tweet your comments to us using the hashtag WallaceHouse. We'll have people monitoring Twitter, and we'll make sure that your questions get asked. And one of the things that we love at Wallace House is how warmly we are received by the university, and how many great partners we have who have been collaborating with us on these events. LS&A has been a partner in this effort from the beginning, and I would like to invite Dean Andrew Martin up to say a few words about our speaker. Thank you for coming.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you, Lynette. I am thrilled to be here today to introduce today's speaker. Bret Stephens is here to share his thoughts on free speech and the necessity of discomfort. Bret is a brilliant analyst and thoughtful writer, and we are honored that he is here today in Ann Arbor to share his thoughts. Bret is currently a New York Times op-ed columnist and was awarded the 2013 Pulitzer Prize in Commentary for his column Global View in the Wall Street Journal, receiving the honor for what the committee describes as his, quote, his incisive columns on American foreign policy and domestic politics, often enlivened by a contrarian twist. Bret currently splits his time between New York and Hamburg, Germany. He has been a regular panelist on the Journal Editorial Report, a weekly political talk show carried by Fox News. Previously, he was the foreign affairs columnist for the Wall Street Journal, a member of the Journal's editorial board, and the deputy editor of the editorial page, responsible for international opinion. He joined the Journal in 1998, working in New York and then Brussels. In January 2002, he was named editor-in-chief of the Jerusalem Post. Bret then returned to the Wall Street Journal in 2004. Bret has reported stories from around the globe and interviewed scores of world leaders. He has received numerous journalistic awards and commendations and holds 2 honorary doctorates. His book, America in Retreat, The New Isolationism and the Coming Global Disorder, was published to wide acclaim in 2014. We're also extremely grateful to have him serving the University of Michigan as a national judge for the Livingston Awards. Please join me in welcoming Bret Stephens to the University of Michigan.
Dean Martin, thank you for the beautiful introduction. Just one small correction. I used to be a contributor on Fox News many years ago. I am currently a contributor on MSNBC, which tells you something. I guess before I get started, I should just get one question out of the way. I often am asked, why is it that I moved from the Wall Street Journal to the New York Times? And the short answer to that is that I was so sick of being hated while I was at the Journal for my Never Trump views that I decided to go to the Times so that I could be hated for all of my other views. Well, let me begin by expressing my very deep appreciation for Lynette and for those lovely words of welcome, as well as for her team at Knight Wallace House for hosting me here in Ann Arbor today. It's a great honor. I think of Knight Wallace as a citadel of American journalism. And Lord knows, we need a few citadels because today, journalism, and here I'll contradict you somewhat, Lynette, journalism is a profession under not one but several sieges, to name a few. There is, first, the economic siege, particularly the collapse of traditional revenue streams, which has undermined the ability of scores of news organizations to remain financially healthy and invest in the kind of in-depth investigative and enterprise and local and foreign journalism this country so desperately needs. There is a cultural siege, starting with the fact that ever fewer Americans, especially younger Americans, make a habit of reading a newspaper or news magazine on a regular basis anymore, as well as the fact that a growing number of Americans seem to think that if something is reported in the so-called mainstream press, it is ipso facto untrue. There's a technological siege, which not only has changed the way we work and distribute our work, but has also created a new ecosystem in which it is increasingly difficult to distinguish fact from opinion, clickbait from substance, and real news from fake. Fourth, need I even mention it, there is the President of the United States. We are all familiar with the ways in which Donald Trump's demagogic assault has already normalized presidential mendacity, mainstreamed alternative facts, and desensitized millions of Americans to both. I'll get to him in a moment. But there is also a fifth siege, and this is the one I want to focus on today. This is the siege of the engaged and, it sometimes seems, perpetually enraged audience. This is no small thing when it comes to the health, reputation, and future prospects of our profession. Journalism, by its nature, must necessarily be responsive to its audience, attuned to its interests, sensible to its tastes, alert to its evolution. Fail to do this, and you might not survive as a news organization, never mind as an editor, reporter, or a columnist. At the same time, journalism can only be as good as its audience. Intelligent coverage requires intelligent readers, viewers, and listeners. We cannot, as news organizations, invest in long-form, in-depth journalism for readers interested only in headlines, first paragraphs, or listicles. We cannot purchase the service of talented wordsmiths and expert editors if people are indifferent to the quality of prose. We cannot maintain expensive foreign bureaus if audiences are uninterested in the world beyond our shores. We cannot expect columnists to be provocative if readers cancel their subscriptions the moment they feel triggered, ahem, by an opinion they dislike. In sum, we cannot be the keepers of what you might call liberal civilization. And I'm using the word liberal in its broad philosophical sense, not the narrow ideological one, if our readers have illiberal instincts, incurious minds, short attention spans, and even shorter fuses. An example. Last November, the New York Times published a profile of a 29-year-old Ohio man named Tony Hoveder. Mr. Hoveder is a welder from a suburb of Dayton. He's happily married, middle class, polite, plays drums, cooks pasta aglio olio, and loves Seinfeld. He is also a proud and avowed Nazi sympathizer. He started out on the political left, moved over to the Ron Paul right, and ended up marching with the anti-Semitic white nationalists at Charlottesville. He doesn't believe 6 million Jews died in the Holocaust and thinks Hitler was, and I quote, kind of chill. The profile by Times reporter Richard Fawcett was a brilliant case study in Hannah Arendt's banality of evil. Hoveder is not a thug, even if his ideas are thuggish, not a monster, even if he takes inspiration from one, not insane, even if his ideas are crazy. He reminds us that a diabolical ideology gains strength not because devils propagate it, but because ordinary men embrace it. And he warns us, as Bertolt Brecht put it after the Second World War, the womb is fertile still, from which that crawled. Lest anyone doubt what Fawcett and his editors at the Times think of Hoveder and his ideas, the article was titled, "A Voice of Hate in America's Heartland." This is not, to say the least, a neutral way of introducing the subject. Yet that did not seem enough for some Times readers who erupted with fury at the publication of the article. Nate Silver, the paper's former polling guru, said the piece, quote, did more to normalize neo-Nazism than anything I've read in a long time. An editor of the Washington Post accused us of producing, quote, long, glowing profiles of Nazis when we should have focused on, quote, the victims of their ideologies. The Times followed up with an explanatory and somewhat apologetic note from Fawcett's editor. Now, no doubt, there may have been ways to improve the profile. There always are. But there was something disproportionate, not to say dismaying, about the way that so many readers rained scorn on the Times' good faith effort to better understand just what it is that makes someone like Hoveder and his movement tick. Just what do these readers think a newspaper is supposed to do? A newspaper, after all, isn't supposed to be a form of mental comfort food. We are not an advocacy group, a support network, a cheering section, or a church affirming a particular faith, except, that is, a faith in hard and relentless questioning. Our authority derives from our willingness to challenge authority, not only the authority of those in power, but also the authority of commonplace assumptions, and conventional wisdom and comforting illusions. In other words, if we aren't making our readers somewhat uncomfortable every day, we simply aren't doing our job. There is an old saying that the role of the journalist is to afflict the comfortable and comfort the afflicted. This saying is wrong. The role of the journalist is to afflict, period. News is new. New information, new challenges, new ideas, and it is meant to unsettle us. That is a good thing. To be unsettled or discomforted is the world's great motivator. It is a prick to conscience, a prod to thinking, a rebuke to complacency, and a spur to action. Now, when I say we need to be making our readers uncomfortable, I don't mean we should gratuitously insult them if we can avoid it. But neither should we make any effort to play to their biases or feed this or that political narrative or dish the dirt only on the people we love to hate or avoid certain topics for fear of stirring their anger, even if it means a few canceled subscriptions. I know whereof I speak. In the age in which subscribers account for an ever greater share of our revenue, publishers will have to be as bold in standing up to occasional, if usually empty, threats of mass cancellations for this or that article as they were and still are in standing up to the demands of advertisers. What I mean by making readers uncomfortable is to offer the kind of news that takes aim at your own deeply held convictions and shibboleths. There are people on the political right who don't like hearing that the correlation between firearms and homicides is positive, not inverse. But a positive correlation is what the data show. There are people on the left who may believe that genetically modified so-called frankenfoods are bad for your health, but the overwhelming weight of scientific evidence tells us that they are 100% fine to eat. The truth may set you free, but first it is going to tick you, or at least a lot of other people, off. This is why free speech requires constitutional protection, especially in a democratic society. Free speech may be the most essential vehicle for getting the truth out, but the truth, as anyone minimally versed in history knows, is rarely popular at first. Barely 50 years ago, it was an unpopular truth that there was absolutely nothing unnatural about the love that went by the horrible name of miscegenation. Other unpopular truths one could mention include gay rights, women's suffrage, and evolution. These truths could only have made their debut in the public square and eventually gain broad public acceptance under the armed guard, so to speak, of the First Amendment. But not just the First Amendment. In addition to a legal sanction, free speech has flourished in the United States because we have a long-standing cultural bias in favor of the gadfly, the muckraker, the contrarian, the social nuisance. For over a century, newspapers and publishers and producers, at least the more enlightened ones, have gone out of their way to make allowances for opposing points of view. They have done so not because they have no strong convictions of their own, but rather out of a profound understanding that the astute presentation of divergent views makes us more thoughtful, not less, and that we cannot disagree intelligently unless we first understand profoundly. They have done so because they believe that social progress depends on occasionally airing outrageous ideas that, on close reflection, aren't outrageous at all. They hold firm to the conviction that moving readers out of their political or moral comfort zones, even at the risk of causing emotional upset, is good for the mind and the soul. Ultimately, they do so because we will not be able to preserve the culture and institutions of a liberal republic unless we are prepared to accept, as Judge Learned Hand put it in 1944, that, and I quote, The spirit of liberty is the spirit which is not too sure that it is right, and must therefore have the willingness to listen to the other side. This was what Adolf Ochs knew in 1896 when he promised that under his stewardship, the New York Times would, and I quote, invite intelligent discussion from all shades of opinion. The Times may not have always lived up to that promise as well as it might have done, but as some of you may have noticed, it most emphatically is now, to the loud consternation of some of our readers. I do my best to appreciate the concerns of those readers. I understand that many of them, many of us, feel like the 2016 election marked a political watershed in which liberties we have long taken for granted are being attacked and possibly jeopardized by a president whose open contempt for a free press has few precedents in the last 200 years of American history. I understand the justifiable fear these readers have for a White House in which the truth is always optional and in which normal standards of courtesy or decency have lost the purchase they previously had under Democratic and Republican administrations alike. I also understand that these readers see the New York Times as a citadel, if not the citadel, in standing up to this relentless assault by the president and his minions on liberal values by standing for the truth. I think those readers are right, which is one big reason I joined the Times 10 months ago, voluntarily I might add, after a long career at the Wall Street Journal. The country needs at least one great news organization that understands that the truth is neither relative nor illusory nor a function of the prevailing structures of power, but also that the truth is many-sided, that none of us has a lock on it, and that we can best approach it through the patient accumulation of facts and a vigorous contest of ideas. That, at any rate, is what I think we are trying to do at the Times, and I can only hope that more people will see its virtue as time goes on. That obviously demands good and consistent communication on our part, but it also requires intelligence on the part of our readers. How can we get our readers to understand that the purpose of the Times is not to be a tacit partner in the so-called resistance, which would only validate the administration's charge that the paper is engaged in veiled partisanship rather than truth-telling? Some readers, for example, resent the Times for some of the unflattering coverage of Hillary Clinton throughout the last presidential campaign, as if the paper's patriotic duty was to write fluff pieces about her in order to smooth her way to high office. Again, do these readers understand that we are in the business of news, not public relations? And does it not occur to them that perhaps the real problem was coverage that was not aggressive enough, allowing Mrs. Clinton to dominate the Democratic field in 2016 despite her serious and only belatedly apparent shortcomings as a candidate? As it is not as if there is a great surfeit of pro-Trump news and opinion in the pages of the Times, and I think that that is a shortcoming of ours. We are a country in which about 40% of the electorate seems to be solidly behind the president, and it behooves us to understand and even empathize with that portion of the electorate rather than caricature or demonize it. Donald Trump became president because millions of Americans who voted for Barack Obama in 2012 voted Republican 4 years later. Those who claim that this presidency is a product of racism need some better explanation to account for that remarkable switch. And perhaps by gaining a better understanding of those vote flippers, those of us who oppose the president might stand a better chance of turning those voters for 2020. The deeper point, however, is that if one really wants to resist Trump, at least in a philosophical sense, especially those of us who are in the news media, we might start by trying not to imitate him or behave the way he does. Thus, the president is hostile to the First Amendment. Let's be consistent and expansive champions of the First Amendment. The president speaks of the news media as enemies of the American people. Let's refuse to descend into open warfare against him and his partisans and fairly represent the widest possible angles of American life. The president belittles and humiliates his Republican political rivals, calls for Hillary Clinton to be jailed, and hosts mass rallies in which he urges his followers to violence. Let's hear from and be respectful to all of our detractors and political opponents. The president loves to find excuses to feel insulted and indignant, both because his skin is so thin and because it thrills his base. Let's hold off on the hair-trigger instinct to take offense, even when we're discomfited by arguments and ideas we dislike and even hate. The president accuses first, gathers evidence later. Let's try to do the opposite. The president embraces some of the uglier forms of white identity politics. Let's eschew identity politics in general in favor of old-fashioned concepts of citizenship and universalism. I could go on, but you get the point. The answer to a politics of right-wing illiberalism is not, I repeat, is not a politics of left-wing illiberalism. It is a politics of liberalism, period. This is a politics that believes in the virtues of openness, reason, toleration, dissent, second-guessing, respectful but robust debate, individual conscience and dignity, a sense of decency, and, not least important, a sense of humor. In a word, enlightenment. It is a capacious politics with plenty of room for the editorials of, say, the New York Times and those of the Wall Street Journal. And it is an uncomfortable politics because it requires that each side recognize the rights and legitimacy and perhaps even the value of the other. To be a genuine liberal is to live with the knowledge that somehow, on some things, you're probably wrong. It is to live with self-doubt and so with humility. The nomination and election of Trump was, for me, the plainest evidence of the extent to which the liberal spirit has withered on the political right. I've written and spoken about this phenomenon many times before, so I won't get into it here. What worries me is the extent to which it is equally prevalent on the political left. Case in point. Last month, I wrote a column under the title, quote, a modest immigration proposal, ban Jews. Let you sit on that one. Now, the word modest might have been a tip-off to modestly educated readers that I was not, in fact, proposing to ban Jews at all. My point was to note that Jewish immigrants of a century ago, including my own ancestors, faced the same prejudices that modern-day immigrants from S-hole countries face today, and yet went on to great success. In other words, it was a pro-immigration piece in line with many other pro-immigration pieces that I've written for the Times. Social media went berserk. I was called, quote, the official New York Times columnist of the alt-right, guilty of, quote, garden variety bigotry. Others accused me of giving aid and comfort to neo-Nazis, even if perhaps I wasn't quite a neo-Nazi myself. A great deal of the reaction was abusive and obscene. By now, I'm sufficiently immunized to the way social media works that none of this hurts me personally, at least not too much. And at its best, social media is a tool for injecting more speech from a vastly wider and more diverse variety of voices than we could ever hear from before into our national conversation. What bothers me is that too many people, including those who are supposed to be the gatekeepers of liberal culture, are using tools of social media to try to shut the speech of others down or to ruin their reputations by smearing them. How many people bother to read these days before they condemn? Are people genuinely offended, or are they looking for a pretext to be offended because taking offense is now the shortest route to a certain form of political empowerment? Am I, as a columnist, no longer allowed to use irony as a rhetorical device because there's always a risk that bigots and dimwits might take it the wrong way? Can I rely on context to make my point clear, or must I write in fear that any sentence can be ripped out of context and pasted onto Twitter to be used against me? Is a plodding, Pravda-like earnestness of tone and substance the only safe way of going forward? Perhaps the most worrisome question is, to what extent are people censoring themselves for fear of arousing the social media frenzies? There's a reason why Katie Roiphe is writing about the so-called whisper networks of women who aren't 100% in line with the Me Too movement, and it should profoundly alarm anyone who cares for Me Too and its success that such a piece should have needed to be written in the reliably liberal pages of Harper's Magazine, no less. The job of Me Too is to put a firm and hopefully final stop to all forms of sexual predation, not to enforce speech codes. This move toward left-wing illiberalism is not new, and the list of thinkers who have waged war against that illiberalism, from Arthur Schlesinger Jr. in the 1940s to Christopher Hitchens in the 2000s, amounts to a pantheon of liberal courage. I think we are awaiting our own new Hitchens today, in case any of you, especially the younger among you, want to apply for the job. All you need is a first-class brain and a cast-iron stomach. So where does this leave us? I gave this talk the title, Free Speech and the Necessity of Discomfort. Yesterday morning, when I retweeted Knight Wallace's tweet advertising this speech, someone wrote, and I quote, "Man, I hope he gets shouted down at some point." Maybe he was being ironic. At any rate, I'm happy to note that none of you has shouted me down so far. I trust that's because all of you recognize that even if I may have said some things that made you uncomfortable and with which you disagree, even profoundly disagree, there is a vast difference between intellectual challenge and verbal thuggishness, between a robust and productive exchange of ideas and mere bombast, between light and heat. I think it's fair to say that Americans of different ideological stripes feel that many things have gone profoundly amiss in our social and political life in recent years. We all have our diagnoses as to what those many things are, but one of them, surely, is that we are rapidly losing the ability to talk to one another. The president has led the way in modeling this uncivil style of discourse, but he has plenty of unwitting imitators on the progressive left who are equally eager to bully or shame their opponents into shutting up because they deem their ideas morally backward or insufficiently woke. As each side gathers round in their respective echo chambers and social media silos, the purpose of free speech has become increasingly more obscure. It isn't, or is not merely so that we can hear ourselves or those with whom we agree speak. It's also to hear what other people with other views have to say. To hear such speech may make us uncomfortable, as well it should. Discomfort is not injury. An intellectual provocation is not a physical assault. To hear speech with which we disagree may cause us to wince. Over time, it can also sharpen our thinking or even change our minds. In either case, it's hard to see how we can't benefit from it, at least if we choose to do so. My plea to you this afternoon is this: make that choice. Democracy is enriched if you do, and so are you. Thank you very much.
Thank you for being Bret. We're going to open up to questions. While people are having a chance to come to the microphones and Jen Guerra is checking Twitter, I would like to ask you a question. You spoke to it a bit about dangers to the press, but we had a conversation yesterday. You see the mail that comes to you, you see the mail and the conversations and things directed at the New York Times. Our fellows who are out on the trail experience what it's like on both sides, the atmosphere toward the press today. And when we talk about free speech, we also mean freedom of the press. And so I would love for you to just talk a little bit more about what you see in terms of people's concept of what a free press means today and what's in danger and what do we do about it?
That's an important question, Lynette. Thank you for asking it. I am depressingly convinced that sometime in the next few years we are going to have a mass casualty incident at a news organization. Not obviously directly at the behest of any political leader, but because an idea has been introduced into the public mind that the American media is indeed, as Donald Trump so memorably put it almost exactly a year ago, an enemy of the American people. And there are always people ideologically or psychiatrically at the margins who are inclined to take those words seriously. Some of what comes to my inbox, some of what comes to my voicemail is profoundly frightening, and on a number of occasions law enforcement has had to look into some of these threats. And I know that what's true of me is true of a great many of our colleagues. But even at a level below that, people seem to have the assumption that a free press is a press that agrees with them. And I think that is a kind of debasement of the American mind, this idea that to read the news is to read the news you happen to believe is true. Now, in fact, if my point of this speech if I had any point in this speech, it was something closer to the opposite. The point of the news is to find yourself surprised and discomfited and alarmed. So we are increasingly inhabiting not just our own ideological silos, which is concerning, although that's a long-standing reality that's been turbocharged by social media, but I think we're increasingly inhabiting our own fact silos. And that's very difficult to sustain democratic life if, contrary to what Daniel Patrick Moynihan famously said, everyone does seem to think they're entitled to their own facts, which obviously they are not. So, look, there's a reason I chose to speak about this as opposed to, my passion for Baroque architecture, which is that we seem to think that we are living in a parentheses historically, that we had a fluke election and something strange is happening in this country that will evanesce in 3 to, I think, 7 years' time, right? I think we are, in fact, at the beginning of something. And unless we are very careful, and especially careful at institutions like Michigan, to put a stop to it, it's a process that's only going to accelerate going forward. That's why I'm giving this talk today. So I guess I'll the left, obviously.
Mr. Stephens, I want to thank you for the column you wrote last October in which you called for the repeal of the Second Amendment.
Wrote it again this week.
Right, I read the second one, but I have no illusions that you and I would get your wish on that. But the recognition that parts of our genius Constitution from 1789 don't really work anymore, there's so many others, and I wonder whether, as a conservative, that's something that you would explore a bit, because whether it's the Electoral College or whether it's the Senate itself, in which which is a relic of 18th century colonial large and small rivalries, we've got a mechanism that doesn't necessarily work real well anymore. And I wonder whether that's something that you might address, whether it's a broader problem than just the Second Amendment. And maybe it's part of the problem we have now when people see leaders chosen who don't get majority support. Mm-hmm. That's a problem. What do you think about that?
Let me take the immediate point on the Second Amendment and then briefly touch on the larger question, because you haven't asked a question, you've asked a shelf of PhD theses. On the immediate point, I'm calling for a repeal to the Second Amendment because I don't think this country can get a handle on its gun problem if at some level a 19-year-old child who simply hasn't received the psychiatric care or attention that he requires is able to get his hands on a semi-automatic weapon and murder 17 people, or some other guy showing no symptoms of any sort of mental distress is able to purchase 33 such weapons in the space of just 12 months in order to rain mayhem on a concert in Las Vegas. And at the end of the day, state by state gun control legislation doesn't do it, because you know very well that even if Chicago has tight restrictions, Wisconsin doesn't, or Indiana doesn't. So that patchwork simply doesn't work unless you get at the root of the issue, which is at some level some right to own, a constitutional right to own firearms. You're never going to get a grip on a problem that consumes us in a way that no other developed country seems consumed by. Conservatives went nuts when I made this case, and I thought, that's so strange, because I'm actually proposing a conservative solution to what I consider a problem, which is go through a constitutional process to at least repeal the amendment, or at least begin speaking about repealing the amendment. I'm under no illusions it's going to happen this year. Then again, 25 years ago, people were under no illusions that there would never be marriage equality in this country, and look what you can achieve if you plant an idea. On the second point, the sort of larger point, look, I don't know. I mean, I really don't know. Is bicameralism, is unicameralism a better system than a bicameral system of the kind of strange sort that we have now? No, I suspect you would be exchanging one set of problems for another. In the matter of the Electoral College, the real problem is someone in Hillary's campaign forgot that a majority didn't suffice. You know, they had to be fighting here in Michigan and Ohio for that sliver of votes rather than sending her to Arizona. So I'm not sure if the answer is to abolish the Electoral College, because some of these sort of vestigial constitutional mechanisms that we have are well entrenched. We know they pretty much work, and we don't know what we get once we shelve them. So there's always the danger that you get rid of something you think is bad, and then you adopt a whole slew of other problems. As I said, I'm conservative, so my instinct is always a certain kind of reluctance to institute changes as fundamental as the ones that you seem to advocate.
Thank you.
Yes.
Hi. So I want to talk about a recent piece that you wrote, The Smearing of Woody Allen.
Yeah. How did I know this question was going to come?
Yeah, so I would say that my biggest complaint about it, aside from it being blatant rape apologism, is also that it's extremely intellectually lazy, especially when you just stood up here for an hour and talked about how we need to be intellectually relentless. In fact, you even later published a correction where you mentioned that an earlier version of this column misidentified a Yale New Haven hospital investigation as the only contemporaneous and independent investigation of Dylan Farrow's allegations. So what I thought was funny about that is that you're so intellectually rigorous, but you didn't even note all the investigations of the case that happened. Also, you didn't mention that 95 to 98% of rape charges are proven to be true. So I'm interested in hearing from you how, I guess you can kind of rationalize the dissonance between what you just stood up here saying about how we need to be intellectually, relentless, and how you wrote the laziest and most offensive piece of all time. That's not even it's not even like a strong. I mean, you talk about like having due process and stuff like that, when this is just the court of public opinion where no one is guaranteed due process. And I would think that you would make that distinction in an intellectually rigorous paper. So I'm interested to hear your response.
Okay, well, thank you for the question. A couple of points. When I make an error, I correct it. What do you do?
I don't make it the first time because I do my research up front.
I am quite sure. I can assure you that if you have ever been a journalist of any kind, you have made errors. And when you make errors, you correct them swiftly and unequivocally. Now, in this particular case, actually, the error is rather on my side, because it turns out that the second contemporaneous 14-month-long investigation.
Yeah, I'm aware of what
I'm speaking now.
Okay.
Okay. That in addition to the Yale New Haven hospital report, which exonerated Allen, there was a second investigation by New York State that was actually twice as long, 14 months long, and also exonerated Allen. Now, in terms of the third investigation, the Connecticut Police Department, at the end of the day, refused to press charges. The investigator in that case said he believed that he had enough evidence to go forward, but he was later reprimanded by the state of Connecticut. Now, my point, in fact, was not to acquit Woody Allen. My point was simply to argue that the evidence, when it comes to his case, is far more equivocal and fraught and, frankly, questionable than it is when it comes to clear-cut cases like Harvey Weinstein or Kevin Spacey or any number of other people that one might mention. I also said very clearly in the article that even in the court of public opinion, one ought to be entitled to a certain presumption of innocence. And I happen to believe that that ought to be a liberal point of view. Let me give you an example. There was a case when I was a teenager in which reportedly 5 young black men horribly raped a white female jogger in Central Park. And there were prominent advertisements in major newspapers demanding that those 5 who ended up serving long prison sentences be sentenced to death. Those advertisements were put in that paper by the man who later became the 45th president of the United States. Now, one of the reasons why I think liberals rightly believe that this country needs to bend over backwards when it comes not just to legal due process, but to a broader presumption of innocence, is because we think that instances like those are so abhorrent and so scar our conscience as a nation that in the words of the old cliche, we would rather let 100 guilty men go free than hang one innocent man. That was the simple point, that was the simple point of the column. Any fair-minded reader of the column, anyone who actually reads the words of the columns, knows that in a million years, I would never want anything except the most severe punishment for a child molester. It is hard to think of a crime that is more heinous than child molestation. But it also behooves people like me with safe, cushy jobs who aren't going to get fired to say in a public place that maybe there is room not for certainty, but for doubt. For doubt. That was the point of the column. And I would ask you, as a person of, I suspect, liberal conviction, okay? Well, whatever it is, but let me say, some of you, those of you in this room, people of liberal conviction who agree with the thrust of that question, please reserve a percentage of your brain for the possibility that you might be wrong. That you might be wrong. That is the essence of what makes a liberal a liberal. Thank you very much.
Yes, so...
Hey, Tyler from Boston here. Got a question for you. Do you think that the Times and other major news organizations are growing too Washington, too Trump-centric in their news coverage and ignoring other major developments going on in the country? Thank you.
That's a terrific question. And I, as a matter of fact, have to work hard to tell myself that every now and then I need not to write about Donald Trump. Because while I'm writing about Donald Trump's tweets, there is starvation in Venezuela. While we're writing about Donald Trump's tweets, there is a vexing crisis in northern Syria between Turks and Kurds. There's a whole wide world out there, and the degree to which he has sucked up journalistic and political oxygen is just one of the many ways in which I think he's been a destructive force in American politics. Look, I always know when I'm writing a column that if I want like 1,500 comments and go to the top of the most trending, I know how to write that Donald Trump column, because every week the president supplies me with enough ammunition that a minimally capable writer like me, I think, can make hay of it. But we have a problem here in that Trump's trivia just consumes too large a place in our mind. And look, it's a genuine dilemma, because on the one hand, these tweets are significant. The state of mind of the president, the distemper, the thin skin, the vitriol, and above all, the narcissism is in a way the defining fact of our times. And so you need to attend to it. But you can't be consumed by it, and I don't think there's a clear formula for how you find the right balance.
Thank you. You articulated the notion that's quite common that people will hear both sides and the truth will rise. Now, is it really supported by the facts? How many people in the United States still believe that Obama was born in Kenya? How many people hear science on one side and pseudoscience on the other and think that global climate change is a conspiracy, that evolution is a conspiracy? And I could go on with well agreed upon facts or scientific consensus.
Well, yes. I mean, there is an irreducible degree of stupidity in any given public, as H.L. Mencken knew, so well, but it didn't keep him from writing. And it doesn't keep you from thinking that just maybe you might get 51% or 50.1% of the people on the side of the facts. So look, if I woke up every day thinking about how many people are going to willfully misrepresent something I say, accuse me of supporting child molesters and this or that, I wouldn't get out of bed in the morning, to the consternation of maybe some people in this audience. But you do get out of bed, and you do think that there is, in fact, a core constituency of intelligent or educable people who want a better grip on reality than what they're being presented with if they do nothing but watch Sean Hannity every night. Yes, Twitter is asking something.
Yes, Twitter is asking many things. Okay. The first question says, you make a great case for the right to cause offense. Do you have any explanation as to why people have become so quick to take offense?
That's a profound question. Whoever's asking it on Twitter is probably a University of Chicago graduate or something. Look, I don't know. I really don't know. I sometimes feel like we live in an age in which social media empowers histrionics. And the words "I'm offended" have been given so much deference for a variety of reasons, some better than others. I think I had a phrase in here in the speech to that effect, that it's a kind of a route to a certain kind of political empowerment. I think it's incumbent on news organizations like the Times and the editorial page of the Times to say, in response to the words "I'm offended," say, good, now we're getting started. The words "I'm offended" cannot be the end of every single conversation, because that will be the destruction of all discourse in America. There is not a single thing you can say here on any subject where there isn't some one person who is going to be offended. I know this because my wife is a classical music critic for the New York Times and an opera critic. I had no idea how trivial and civilized our political differences really are until I caught a whiff of the kind of vitriol that she sustains by praising an opera soloist whom someone at Parterre Box thinks is a complete idiot and should be sent to song gulag or whatever they do in opera. So there is in every kind of conversation room for offense, and I think part of a intelligent pedagogy, particularly at places like the University of Michigan, and even starting earlier, is to say, good, let's talk about your offense. Let's take it a step further. Let's turn offense into a conversation starter, not a conversation ender.
Okay, and we have another one from Twitter. It says, in your discussion, you talk a lot about free speech and the necessity of discomfort, but how do you counter charges from some quarters that certain speech is so hateful that it constitutes a form of violence?
I think the idea hate speech is violence is a hugely important distinction that all free societies have to maintain. Look, my mother was a hidden child during the Holocaust. Anti-Semitism she came to this country as a displaced person after the war. Anti-Semitism cuts very deeply for me, and so does anti-immigrant bigotry, which is why I write so frequently about it. I think that the most effective way of empowering hateful speech is the attempt to censor it. Because the last thing, or the thing that a creep like Richard Spencer most wants is to have some pretext to be called a martyr. What he most wants is to be able to say that this free speech for thee but not for me is a sign of the profound hypocrisy and rot at the heart of liberal order. And so what we lose by trying to censor hate speech is infinitely greater than what we gain from allowing instances of hate speech to manifest themselves, like herpes sores or whatever. I could have chosen a better metaphor. I think that's a very important point. Just take an example of France, where there are hate speech laws. And there is a well-known comedian who routinely has popularized a kind of Nazi-like salute. I won't repeat it here. But he has become a sensation, and every single time he is fined by the French government, he becomes more powerful. The best way of dealing with him is saying, "You're not funny." That's it. So we have to be extremely careful about giving hateful speakers the very weapon they want by reacting to them with the same illiberal instincts that they bring to the national conversation.
Do you mind if I follow up on that as one of the maybe half a dozen Black people in
Sure, go ahead.
So, you've spoken quite a bit. I'm trying to keep on jumping in front of.
Do you want to come up to the mic?
Yeah, I've come to the mic, so this isn't it. So, you've spoken quite a bit about this idea that as liberals, we need to have doubt in our mind about pretty much everything. And I want to offer, I guess, a challenge to that. Are there things that are not just hateful, but actually oppressive? Or if you look at a lot of hate speech, it's not just that they're upset, but they're calls to violence. They are intimidation. They are threats. And the reality is, if those threats were leveled at anybody who was an individual or towards their property, the law already exists and has been refined for hundreds of years now to support that kind of control and protection. But somehow, when it is applied to a group of people, suddenly, correct me if I'm wrong, you're suggesting that we should have doubt about that, about whether or not we have to receive that. And I guess my question is, are there limits on what I can doubt? And just a little plug for the budding U of M journalists out there that do the Every 3 Weekly. They had a little article that was basically saying, oh, yeah, we're, how did they phrase it? Something about supporting the right to suggest that black people don't have the right to exist. So I don't know about you, but I have no doubts about that, so about my right to exist. So how do you feel about that?
I think, in a sense, although I obviously know this audience is hardly representative, but the right answer to that is to note that any intelligent person who hears a statement like the idea that black people don't have the right to exist is and stupid and wretched and vile. And so then the question is, to what extent does the consensus that those kinds of views are hateful need to have the added legal protection, added sanctions, and so on? And my point is, look, you have to have doubt about everything, including your own doubt. I think I'm paraphrasing Voltaire there. But I think what I'm suggesting to you is not so much a sort of a philosophical or even a moral answer, but it's a pragmatic one. It's about practical wisdom. What would you do in the face of those people, the David Dukes, Richard Spencers, and so on, who make that claim? And my answer to you is that I think the most foolish thing that you could do is to put them in jail. I think that that is a way of turbocharging guys like this Tony Hoveder that I spoke of in my speech. It is a way of arriving at precisely the opposite result than the one that we obviously, agree we would like to get. I don't see any evidence in countries in Europe that have penalized hate speech that the penalties for hate speech have actually been effective. Dean Martin mentioned earlier that I live half my time in Hamburg. My wife is German. And one of the most political phenomena of the last few years has been the return and resurgence of the far right under the guise of this alternative for Deutschland, alternative for Germany party. Now, this is in spite of the fact that Germany has well-entrenched laws against neo-Nazism and Nazi speech. So I think I'm just saying as a matter of practicality, not as a kind of philosophical matter, that we need to be very careful about trying to kill the bug with a hammer and end up, here this is another bad metaphor, hitting our own toe instead. Okay.
I mean, that does nothing to protect us. And I'd just like to point out that we have continuously had free speech over these issues for years, and it hasn't helped. So I don't know that. I would like to push back and give you
Look,
some
I would
doubt,
make the same
but,
case,
yeah.
just by the way, I would make exactly the same case when it comes to anti-Semitism. Okay, that we are better served fighting anti-Semitism through education and through exposing anti-Semites than by trying to round up any anti-Semite we can find and fining them or penalizing them in some way. I guess that is an empirical view that is a much more effective way to fight bigotry than having laws on books which only give racists and bigots an opportunity to claim that they are being persecuted and to draw people like Tony Hoveder to their side. That's my point.
So when you say empirical, do you mean white nationalists marching on Charlottesville and the president saying that they're good people on their side? Is that the empirical evidence you're saying like makes this work? Because it's not working. Like the people in Charlottesville who were killed, they were walking away, right? And the people in Gainesville who were shot at by neo-Nazis, they were standing on the street.
Right.
It's not just about ignoring it or try to expose it. Like when it's coming at us, people of color, Jews, trans people across this community who are at threat of the people, the KKK 30 miles away who are gonna be here, right? It's kind of shitty to say, just ignore it. Like,
no, I'm not saying ignore it.
or expose it, because exposing it is not making it go away.
No, I would be the last person to say to ignore it or pretend it doesn't exist. It very clearly exists. And that march in Charlottesville targeted all of us of any color or religious persuasion. But I don't think, and I would continue to contend, that I think the worst way to deal with those thugs in Charlottesville is to round them up and put them in jail. Because the next thing you know, what you have now, which is a frightening and disgusting, but I think still relatively marginal neo-Nazi movement would gain prodigious strength. And that's the last thing you or I or anyone in this room would want. I should go to this side.
Yeah, okay. So first off, I just want to say thank you for being here and giving us a perspective on public policy that we rarely get to hear as students at this university. And then I would just say, and then I would just ask that. So my question is, you've spoken a lot about failures in drawing false moral equivalencies, whether it is the Obama administration's moral blindness, as you referred to it, in dealing with the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, or President Trump's what you called shameful attempts at putting the U.S. on moral par with Putin's Russia. So my question for you is about a column you wrote, I think at the end of last year, about the Zionist Organization of America when they invited Steve Bannon to speak at their annual dinner. Mm-hmm. You said that that organization, in that action, by inviting someone who was what you believe to be affiliated with the alt-right, put themselves on moral par with a different organization, the Jewish Voice for Peace, which the Anti-Defamation League has referred to as promoting terrorists like Baghdadi, and speaking out and harassing gay rights organizations over the years, and has generally been a problematic organization that the Anti-Defamation League has said has veered dangerously close toward anti-Semitic rhetoric. So my question for you is, does the action of inviting Steve Bannon, do you think that do you still believe that those things are on moral par, put the two organizations on complete moral par? And then my follow-up to that would be, do you believe that with moral equivalence, these things kind of exist on a spectrum, or is that, or is it black and white?
Look, I think that when the ZOA, it's the Zionist Organization of America, is a very right-of-center, Likudnik, Jewish American advocacy organization, invited Steve Bannon to honor him, which was amusing because 2 months later, of course, Steve Bannon was defenestrated by the president, and I'm sure that honor would not be so forthcoming had it come a few months later. I think when it did that, to my mind, it seriously delegitimized itself as a morally serious organization. And I think I had an obligation, and this goes in a sense to some of the questions that came earlier. I have an obligation as a columnist to go after that hammer and tong, because to the extent that my voice carries some weight in the American Jewish world, and I think it does, then having Bret Stephens, who's no one's idea of a left-wing anti-Zionist or whatever, saying that in an unequivocal way was immensely important. Now, you're asking for almost a kind of like counting angels on the head of the pin to sort of see whether the equivalence between Jewish Voice for Peace and ZOA is exactly equivalent or not. But Steve Bannon is a guy who said explicitly that Breitbart was, and I quote, the platform for the alt-right. The alt-right includes people like Richard Spencer and Steve Saylor and these guys who are, without a doubt, bigots and racists, okay? When he said that, he should have been excluded from any kind of polite society or any kind of honor, never mind an office in the White House, but this is a speech for another occasion. And I think that kind of process of making that statement clearly in the pages of the Times under my name was a morally, I don't want to say morally significant because that sounds pompous, but a morally necessary thing to do. Now, I'm not even going to get into the question of ZOA versus JVP, because that sort of takes us all day and I would just be bloviating emptily. But one of the responsibilities as a columnist, especially when you see something on your side, your so-called side, that is morally obnoxious or repellent, is to call it out. I've always felt that it's the business of conservatives, of conservative commentators, to call out the anti-Semitism and the racism and the misogyny and the homophobia, which is far too prevalent on the right. And it's at the same time the business of my colleagues on the left to call out some of the more repressive, illiberal, anti-speech instincts of people who call themselves progressives but behave like they are aspiring totalitarians who want to control speech and thought and action. And that seems to me the kind of the dual obligations that we have. Rather than scoring points with Nick Kristof or whatever silly thing he's written, that's a joke. Nick's a great guy. I would rather spend some time thinking about what has gone wrong with my side of the political aisle. Thanks. Yes.
Hi. Hello, Mr. Stephens. Thank you for coming here to talk. My question has to do with, My question has to do with hypocrisy, I suppose. And I would just like to preface everything I'm about to say by saying I'm a lowly undergrad, and if any of my profs are here, they can probably attest I'm not maybe the best student. But I'm interested in knowing what gives you the sort of sense of superiority that you feel over the more Trump-focused sides of your particular side of the aisle. You are a supporter of the Iraq War, or you were during the early days. You wrote many pieces for the Wall Street Journal defending the Bush administration's imperialism. So we know you to be an imperialist. You have written pieces that many people find deeply problematic pertaining to the Me Too movement and other such movements in America. And you are, frankly, in my mind, up there with, Bill Kristol, Brooks, maybe even Douthat on a bad day. Why do you have faith in the liberal institutions that gave us Donald Trump? And why do you feel the need to denounce him so heavily when he is what you espouse? I mean, as a conservative, he is you, but dumber. He might not have referenced, Swift. He wouldn't have made the Voltaire reference. Probably eats a little bit more fast food, but why are you better than him? What is the value of your liberalism? I mean, I'm not trying to defend Donald Trump. I don't mean to give that impression. But what makes you better than him?
Well, nothing. I mean, look, the New York Times has the extraordinary idea that it should pay me good money to write 2 columns a week. Who am I to say no to that? So I have been given this privilege that many readers feel is unearned and many readers feel has been earned to offer a contention twice a week, right? That's what I'm trying to do. I'm not trying to parade my moral superiority or my intellectual superiority, hang on, let me speak, or anything of the sort. I am simply offering what I hope is an intelligent provocation to an intelligent person like you so that you can say either A, that's weird, I agree with him, or B, he's full of his own initials, right? Took you a second there. And that's fine, okay? Now, when you write as many columns as I have over the space of 15 years now of being a columnist for the Jerusalem Post, and then the Wall Street Journal, and now it's been more than 15 years, but at any rate, a long time, you have all kinds of opinions. And by the way, you have opinions that you later regret. And if you were my wife, I would tell you what those are. But you have all kinds of opinions, and you understand that the benefit of a column is that it is not exactly written on water, but it is written on tomorrow's fish wrap, and you can take it or leave it, right? I've always made the case that as a columnist, I am not an architect. I am a short order cook, right? I am serving you pancakes, and I hope they're good, and they need to be eaten hot, or else they're indigestible. Look back at any column that any columnist has written 6 or 7 years ago. Very, very few of them stand the test of time. That is my job as a columnist. I'm not saying it's a particularly high vocation. If I were really smart, I'd be a doctor. And I thought that was funny. I'm not saying it's a particularly high vocation. I think it's an interesting vocation. And I think it allows me an opportunity to think aloud, so to speak, in front of a large and educated audience and see what happens iteratively when you take on or begin a conversation and learn where that goes. And I think that's an interesting thing to do. It's a happy way of leading my life. Now, if you're going to compare me to David Brooks and Ross Douthat and Bill Kristol, I'm going to say thank you very much. I take that as a compliment. I think these are serious people who had more courage in opposing Donald Trump and everything he stands for than so many other conservatives. And I just want to say, contrary to what you think, I believe in immigration. I believe in free trade. I believe in an engaged and internationalist America that doesn't treat foreign policy as a transaction, but treats it as a duty to sustain free people in far-flung corners of the world. I understand that that idealism sometimes gets the United States into trouble, but I think I can point to many instances in which we've saved the world for having that idealism. I abhor America first. I abhor the kind of equivalence that he showed, moral equivalence that he showed at Charlottesville. I have been unblinking in making this point, and the reason I am no longer at a paper which I served with a deal of devotion for many years has to do with what happened politically. Now, I'm not going to claim any particular heroism. Real heroism belongs to foreign correspondents for the New York Times like C.J. Chivers who are out in Pakistan or whatever risking their necks. But I will say that I believe that I and Ross and David and Bill acted with a lot of honor and integrity because we went against our own side. And I'd like to say that the people I admire most on the left are those who every now and then go against their own side too, because they have a sense of principle that goes beyond partisanship.
Where do you see the future of the conservative movement going? Do you think we're kind of stuck with the populism, nationalism championed by Trump, or do you think we can get back to the conservatism championed by William F. Buckley and Reagan?
Well, one-word answer to your question is hell. Look, American conservatism, let me make this point in a sort of broader, with a wider lens. Those of you who are on the political left, I suspect, know in your hearts that the United States desperately needs an honorable and intelligent and moderate conservative movement. Would you agree with that proposition? You don't want life to just be Democrats all the time, right? You don't want your political spectrum to run from Mrs. Pelosi to Mr. Sanders. Right? You understand that conservatism is a force in politics, and it's best if that force be represented by a party and a set of ideas that you know you will survive for the next 4 to 8 years when the other guy is in power. And I think that for a brief period of time, the American conservative movement became close to what we would like from it. Imperfect in many, many respects, okay? But number one, it was not isolationist. Number two, it ceased being anti-Semitic. Number three, it shed too late, way too late, but at least it attempted to shed a racism that had defined parts of the party for a long time. Number four, it believed in an engaged and international vision of America. It subscribed to the foreign policy of Harry Truman and Dwight Eisenhower. It was outward-looking, and at its best, the Republican Party could have stood for something like inclusion and opportunity and ambition. That those would be the things that you'd want a conservative party to be. To say, look, we want to get government out of your way because we believe that every human being has a right to rise. That, I think, was the conservative movement at its best. But every conservative movement, just like every left-wing movement, has dark impulses. And the dark impulses are nativism and xenophobia and isolationism, white identity politics, and a kind of populist truculence. And what people say to me, oh, you were so patriotic in opposing Trump. In a way, I think that my opposition to Trump was almost more partisan than it was patriotic, because he was wrecking and a set of ideas that I cared for, and I don't think we will be able to recoup easily for at least a generation. I think this is Trump's party, and the bigoted instincts and aggressive manner that he's brought with him are going to be features of Republican politics for a long time, and it's going to make it very, very difficult for me to vote for that party again. It is impossible, and I said this publicly, it is impossible to vote for a party whose nominal leader embraced an accused, a many times accused pedophile like Judge Moore in Alabama. That's just, it's a shame. Hopefully there will be a third party like in France, and we'll get our Macron, and everything will be great, and we'll have a fabulous First Lady, and everything will be great.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for your talk and for answering the questions. You mentioned University of Chicago earlier. I'm a U Chicago graduate, and I don't agree with the question that was asked. But I understand why you think it would come from there. So you mentioned this in the beginning, and I'm hoping that we could just circle back, because I think that a lot of the substance of your talk actually can't really stand unless we address some of the other pillars that you mentioned at the beginning, right? So I think, this is personally, I want to hear you, how you help us walk through this. So I think that you were being I think that you are blaming the public a bit too much without acknowledging how corporate media is responsible for many of the problems you describe. As an educator, I also believe in a baseline of rationality and rigorous thought. Otherwise, like, there would be no point in doing what I do either, or any of us in this room for that matter. But here's what I mean. Truth, as you describe it, seems to be defined mainly by your own words on its conflictual relationship with public opinion. You do express hope in the emergence of truth through, as you said, the slow accumulation of facts and vigorous contest of ideas. But this, again, I think is disingenuously leaving out the corporate calculus of media as a business. Again, anyone who knows or who watches or reads news knows that the conflict has become an end in itself. Sucked dry of any notion of the advance towards a better truth or a public good, or anything beyond a market-driven push to turn news into a marketplace whose driving goal is not to advance anything like truth or public good, but to present an array of approved views that can appeal to different market segments, the very echo chambers that you bemoan. So what I'm asking is that from a corporate media angle, can you work that into what you've told us here today? Because I think there's a real danger in trying to pathologize the readers themselves as just being more inclined towards discomfort and not recognizing the very long, I mean, it goes back to like the Telegraph. It's not anything new, but this long history of mainstream media essentially driving the segments of public discourse according to a business model that actually now thrives on the very things that you are talking about, the very conflict of opinion that is, in fact, what media is giving us, and all media is giving us. And I think it's really problematic. What? All right, there you go. You get the point.
I think you're asking an exceptionally intelligent question. You are probably right that I slighted in the talk, although that was mostly a matter of space, not inattentiveness, the fact that that public tastes and public concepts of truth have been, and how we arrive at truth, have been debased by certain kinds of corporate media that have peddled a kind of a notion of journalism which is anathema to my own, and which has kind of, fed the stupidification of the American public. I mean, it really is true. If your morning begins with Outnumbered, I don't even know when it's on, and ends with Hannity, and there's Laura Ingraham in between, you might not be entirely faultless in having the sort of worldview that you do. On the other hand, you're still the person turning on the television. So look, it's a profound and interesting question that you're asking, and you're probably right that if I gave this some more thought, I would have added a few paragraphs along the lines that you had, that you proposed, that there is a fact that in the way that supply creates its own demand, at least if you think in certain economic ways, that was probably the most controversial thing I said all night. But if you think that supply creates its own demand, supply can create its own sort of tastes and provide its own kind of education. I just don't think that that's the whole story, because you do have to ask yourself, why are people tuning in to begin with? And why are they purposely eschewing, is it eschewing or eschewing? Eschewing. Why are they purposely eschewing sources of news that they happen to know are likelier, more reliable, and fairer? So I don't think it's just, you can sort of say corporate media has led us to this pass. Corporate media had reasons to create the kind of programming that it did. But I think it's a typical University of Chicago question, which is, Just the sharpest one so far. What can I say?
On that note, yes.
Thank you very much.
That was 2 University of Chicago references too many, and so I had to come up onto the stage. Thank you all for coming, and for those of you who came out to several of our events, Bret's talk here was part of a series of events at the University on free speech and inclusion. They were events that Wallace House was planning anyway, and they happened to align with this effort at the university to get more people talking about free speech. We are doing it from the stage, but there are organizations on campus doing it in real time every day. I want to acknowledge the students who came from We Listen, which is a group on campus trying to bring people together to talk in civil ways across points of thought and difference. There's good work being done here at the university, and we support your work. And the thing I love about these conversations about speech and inclusion is that in a series of events under the banner of free speech, we actually got people in a room to talk about journalism over and over again this year, which is something that we care about and we are going to keep doing. In the same way that we talked about leaders and very reprehensible characters and what the university should and shouldn't do, I also don't want the university telling me who I can bring here to speak for Wallace House. And so to the extent that you all keep coming out to support our events, even if you think Bret Stephens is too conservative, or Lydia Polgreen is too liberal, or David Farenthold from the Washington Post is from the fake news Washington Post, or Joshua Johnson, who was here last week, is from that liberal NPR. We appreciate your support, and we will keep bringing those programs to you. We will keep those conversations going. And any one of us who is involved in journalism here at the university would share Bret's thoughts and the thoughts of our last questioner about what's wrong with journalism. And there's also a lot that's right with journalism, and it deserves to be supported. And so thank you all for coming. We will see you at our next event on China's soft power, and have a good evening.
Thank you.